Hi, today we want to talk about salvation history and covenantal traditions. Salvation history, as we know, was crucial for the Vatican II Council. It was a framework that was imbued those documents. So we'll look at the salvation history in terms of an overview, and then we'll move towards covenant traditions. In terms of, first, let's begin with a discussion about the Bible in terms of its location. It is a book that was composed here in the, what I call here, the Earth's Faithful Corner. It's a place where the great river civilizations converged. If you take a look here at this map, we see what's called the Fertile Crescent. So the great river civilizations of Babylon here in the south, and then Assyria, a little bit to the north, not to be confused with Syria, which is just north of Israel, and then Egypt. What links these great civilizations is this Fertile Crescent. The area between here is all desert, so you can't take a military army across the desert. You have to follow the water sources. Of course, Europe would also be a land bridge towards Africa, is through the area of Israel, or as it was called previously, Canaan. This is not a very wide area. Even in modern-day Israel today, it's 70 miles across the Israel from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. And so this narthex, where if you could bottle up an army here, you had strategic advantage. You could protect, either you're an Egyptian, you're protecting your eastern flank, or if you're an Assyrian army, control this area, you can protect yourself against Egypt's invasion on your western flank. Also, these nations, or this area, is not just a political narthex, it's also a geological one. So the tectonic plates which underlie the Earth's surface actually converge here. You have the African plate pushing northwards towards the North Pole. You have the Eurasian plate trying to push southward towards the South Pole. These plates move at about the distance of that your fingernail would grow for a year, in the course of a year, that same length if you didn't cut your fingernails. And so that friction caused by these two great plates colliding against each other, pushing the Arabian plate along with it, creates the earthquake activity in the area, and in previous times even volcanic activity. So this corner of the earth is fraught with friction, fraught with factions, fraught with military action. It, in fact, was the linchpin of the ancient Mediterranean world. It connected the three great continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. So it maybe isn't surprising. This is where God decided to reveal himself more fully, because that's the place that needed God's love and mercy most abundantly. When we talk about the Bible, which of course is a book written in this, stems from that narthex, it's important to realize it's a library. Of course, it's called the Bible, but the Greek word is ta biblia, and so this book is a collection of books, because ta biblia means the books. And even more than just being a library, it's probably better to follow Bishop Skilba's description as a library of a collection of libraries. And so we'll get into that more as we go through the course. But the idea here is when we read the Bible, we're not reading a book, we're reading books. And they've been grouped together in certain ways. Early on, this was recognized that we have, if you will, a collection of libraries. We have different kinds of books. This is a very standard way from the earliest tradition. Even you see this in Jesus's. In the Old Testament, he'll talk about what does it say in the Law and the Prophets, and then he'll quote from the Psalms. So these three divisions, the Torah, or Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, and then you have the prophets, and then finally the writings, which would be Psalms, Proverbs, that kind of material. Another way to divide these books is Pentateuch, historical books, prophets, and wisdom literature. This is a division that became popular within Christian tradition, particularly amongst Catholic circles. And it simply divides out some of the books that are in the prophets and groups them with the historical books and some of the writings as part of the historical books collection. But what we want to do today is look at the overarching narrative. Even though this is a collection of books, there's still a plot line, if you will, that runs through the Bible. And so the question really is, how do we find that narrative strand? How best to describe it? How best to understand it? Salvation history was a dominant model, came about really from the beginning, but received a critical reflection during the 19th and 20th century and became the dominant model in the 50s through the 70s. So it's not surprising that when Vatican II was written, it drew heavily upon that biblical research, because in some ways that was cutting-edge biblical research at the time. So one way to make sense, therefore, of the different biblical books is this salvation history timeline or framework or plot. And what salvation history did was focus upon events, the intervention of God, the acts of God, sometimes described the mighty works of God in the world. This is where God most profoundly revealed his nature, is through his interventions or actions in events. And so most people, when they try to articulate what were those pivotal events, they start with, of course, with Adam and Eve. You go from Adam and Eve, the creation and the fall. We move then to Noah, where God tries to recreate the world by starting over in some sense, washing it clean and trying to reestablish the earth. That doesn't work so well, so God then focuses upon one man, Abram, and his wife Sarah, and he promises them that they will be fruitful and multiply, and their descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and he promises them this faithful corner of the earth, this land of Israel. Of course, they end up traveling down to Egypt, where they're put into slavery, and then the next mighty act of God is to free them from slavery through that dramatic story of the plagues and fleeing the Pharaoh through the Red Sea. And the next step would be then bringing the people back into the land of Israel, which has now been occupied, and so there's a need to conquer it through the interventions of a work of Joshua and the tribes. We can then jump forward to when the people say, well, we need a government. We need a centralized government. So the establishment of the monarchy and of David and Solomon, starting with Saul and moving to David and Solomon, and a new covenant, the covenant with David, that his house will live forever. But then, of course, that kingdom divides into the north and the south, and ends up that the north gets defeated by the Assyrians in 722, and basically in the biblical account sort of disappears. And later on, the Babylonians defeat the southern kingdom called Judah, where Jerusalem is located along with the temple, and the temple is destroyed. The people are taken into captivity. They're put into exile in Babylon. Cyrus the Great from Persia, which would be modern-day Iran, ends up invading Babylon and frees the people and allows them to come back. They return, they reestablish the temple. And then in this salvation history narrative, the prophetic voice becomes dominant, preparing for Christ. Of course, we have the intervention of God in the world through his Son, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. And through Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection, God reveals himself most fully. Then we have the coming of the Pentecost, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and the spreading of the church throughout the world. So that's your basic narrative string through the Old Testament into the New Testament. One standard telling of the salvation history. And certainly that is one way God has worked in the world and reveals himself through Scripture. Here's another way to depict it. This is sort of my creation of this. I call this the wall of Israelite history, and try to divide it into these bricks. That's what the red squares are trying to indicate, going from that prehistory and the patriarchs and matriarchs to Egypt, to the wandering in the desert, to the coming to the promised land, to the monarchy, to the divided kingdom, to Judah's final defeat and exile, and then finally return and restoration of the temple, then finally this period where the Greeks dominate with Alexander the Great, followed for a brief period of time of independence for about 100 years, where they're self-autonomous again, the people of Israel, until the Romans in 63 BCE or BC become the dominant power and occupy the area. All right, So there's sort of this pattern that we find within the biblical text where you have sort of these, what I call here, preparation periods and kind of this glory periods and these unfaithful periods. That's not, those are rough categories, and we'll talk more about that later. But I put on the side here some possible dates, frameworks on the left-hand column as well, as sort of giving you a historical sort of sweep of this. Now, salvation history comes from, is actually a translation of a term, Heilsgeschichte in Germany, since this kind of framework was developed in Germany. Heil means salvation, Geschichte can be translated history, but it also means story. Interesting enough, in a number of languages, German, Spanish, there's a word used, and here in this case, Geschichte can mean both history and story. Not so in English, which I think throws us off a bit, sometimes theologically. But all the same, this framework was dominant from the 1950s to 1970 into the 70s, and it focused, as I said, on the mighty works or deeds of God. Interesting enough, Catholic biblical scholarship sort of takes greater prominence within the church, critical biblical scholarship, and it's interesting because they found this framework amenable to the Catholic sensibility of God's working within history, which we call tradition. But then a critique grew in the 1980s to this framework. One critique was it sort of reduces the biblical witness to events. While there's a lot of things, a lot of books in the Bible have nothing to do with events. You have laws like the book of Leviticus. You have sayings like the book of Proverbs. You have poems like the book of Psalms. We go on and on and on. So in fact, it doesn't capture the nature of the entire biblical text. Also, there's a sense that it privileged a sort of linear chronological trajectory, that there's an inevitable sort of progression of history, if you will. And certainly you believe that from a standpoint of faith, but it doesn't capture the nuances and the variations and fluctuations within that story. Sort of like my preparation, glory, and then fall kind of framework really doesn't work if you dig down into the text. It's much more complex. Then, even though Catholics initially sort of gravitated to this framework, there was some critique that it was very Protestant, if you will, in that it seemed to indicate that the law on cult had gone away, and now we've moved to this prophetic period. That those set of slides that show the salvation history are pulled from a Protestant site. You can see how it moves to the prophets and then to Christ. And so kind of the temple is still active. The temple is still vibrant in the life of the faith. And so to sort of push that off to the side would seem to tell the story in a way that might indicate a movement away from sacraments, away from ritual, which would be more aligned with the Catholic sensibility of the faith than other traditions. All right, so maybe it's time for, I love this slide, new version 2.0. I'm sure it's the software they're advertising, but I think this is pretty funny in terms of the Bible timeline. So what I want to do, and I'll do this in the next video, is we'll look at another way to look at the salvation history, which focuses upon the covenants and gives us a little different flavor of how God might be acting in the world through that portrayal. So we'll take a look at that in the next video.